Been 22 years since Scott Peterson murdered his wife Laci, who was 8 months pregnant with their son.
He was getting ready to run.
He had cell phones, credit cards.
It was like a real-life soap opera happening in your living room.
When a case stays in the public eye for more than 20 years, people naturally assume every question has already been answered. That is exactly what happened with the Laci Peterson case. Most believed the story was finished and the truth had already been uncovered. However, new developments in 2026 have reopened one of America's most talked-about criminal cases, revealing information that has shocked even those who followed it from the very beginning. A quiet life of a young couple in Modesto. Laci Peterson was 27 years old and 8 months pregnant with her first child when the winter of 2002 settled over Modesto, California. She and her husband Scott had built what looked like an ordinary and hopeful life together in a modest home on Covina Avenue. Friends and family described Laci as warm and full of plans for the baby boy they had already named Connor. Scott worked as a fertilizer salesman, and the couple seemed to move through the days of late pregnancy with the mix of excitement and ordinary routine that marks so many young families. On the morning of December 24th, Scott later told police he left the house around 9:30 or 10 o'clock to drive alone to the Berkeley Marina and go fishing in San Francisco Bay near Brooks Island. When he returned home that afternoon, Laci was gone, and their golden retriever Mackenzie was found wandering outside with the leash still attached. Within hours, the disappearance became a national story. Television cameras filled the quiet streets, and cable news turned every small development into nightly drama that held millions of people in its grip. Scott's affair with massage therapist Amber Fry surfaced almost immediately. He had told her he was a widower spending his first holiday season alone. The revelation transformed public perception overnight. A husband who had been cheating while his pregnant wife vanished looked guilty to people watching from their living rooms, and the investigation itself seemed to move in step with that growing judgment. Prosecutors eventually built their theory around the image of a man who killed his wife inside the house, transported her body to the marina, and dumped her from his newly purchased 14-foot boat, so that the remains would disappear into the bay. No blood, tissue, or DNA consistent with a violent homicide was ever found inside the home, the truck, or the boat. The only physical link to Laci on the boat was 2 strands of hair recovered from under a seat. Concrete anchor Scott had mixed became central to the prosecution story, even though the jury never saw clear proof that those anchors had been attached to a body. The media coverage grew so intense that once the nation decided Scott was the only possible suspect, every other possibility began to fade from official attention, and the official narrative hardened around a single theory that would shape the next 22 years. Yet even as that narrative took hold, a different set of voices was already trying to be heard. The neighbors who said they saw her walking. In the first days after Laci vanished, more than a dozen ordinary people called police and the tip line to report that they had seen a pregnant woman walking a golden retriever in East La Loma Park or along the neighborhood streets on the morning of December 24th. Several of those sightings occurred after the time Scott said he had already left for the marina. Witnesses, including Tony Freitas, Martha Aguilar, Gene Pedrioli, and John Brazil, described a woman with short dark hair who matched Laci's appearance and who appeared to be having trouble controlling the dog. The accounts shared common details about location, timing, and the dog's behavior that made the cluster of reports harder to dismiss as simple mistakes or wishful thinking. A mail carrier who delivered to the Peterson home between 10:35 and 10:55 that morning later recalled that the gate stood open and the dog that usually barked was silent. That observation fit the larger pattern of the other reports. Detective Nanette Tuzby has said that a missing person investigation requires every lead of this kind to be exhausted, because even one credible sighting after the husband left the house would have removed him as a suspect within 48 hours. Instead, the reports were set aside. Police never systematically walked the witnesses back to the exact locations or treated the cluster of accounts as a possible alibi that needed to be eliminated or confirmed through careful follow-up work. None of those witnesses was called to testify at trial in any meaningful way. The possibility that Laci was still alive and walking her dog after Scott drove away simply disappeared from the official narrative that the public and the court would ultimately accept. If you put yourself in the place of those callers, you can sense the quiet frustration that must have followed them for years. They believed they had seen a living pregnant woman in broad daylight, and the official response treated their eyes as unreliable or simply inconvenient. The decision to discount the sightings did more than ignore individual statements. It closed an entire avenue of investigation at the exact moment when the case was still open, and the truth was still reachable if investigators had chosen to pursue it with the same energy they gave to building the case against Scott. While those neighborhood voices were being set aside, another crime was unfolding only steps away from the Peterson front door. The burglary that happened across the street, directly across Covina Avenue. The Medina family left their house around 10:30 on the morning of December 24th for a short holiday trip to Southern California. When they returned on the afternoon of December 26th, they found their home had been burglarized. A safe, jewelry, guns, and tools were gone. Two men named Stephen Todd and Donald Glenn Pierce were later arrested. Both told police the crime happened on December 26th after Laci had already been reported missing. Multiple neighbors reported a suspicious van and men at the Medina property on the 24th itself. One account described men carrying a safe. A confidential informant and later jailhouse conversations claimed that Laci had interrupted the burglary and threatened to call the police. On the morning of December 25th, a stolen van was found fully engulfed in flames roughly 1 mile away behind the home of a relative of Todd. Inside the burned vehicle sat a mattress that tested presumptively positive for blood. A gas can have been placed on top of a portion of the mattress, preserving that area from complete destruction by the fire. Fire investigator Brian Spatulski noted that the fire appeared intentional and designed to erase physical evidence. Defense counsel Mark Garagos has stated that key details of the van and mattress were never disclosed to the defense in real time, and that later testing examined only a small fabric portion rather than the entire piece of evidence. Months after Laci disappeared, investigators from the missing person case and the burglary case met and decided to destroy the remaining Medina evidence. Prosecutors maintained there was no connection and that the burglary occurred after Laci was already gone. The decision to destroy physical material while a murder investigation remained open left a silence that has never been fully explained. You can feel the weight of that choice if you consider how differently the case might have unfolded if the mattress and the van had been treated as possible links rather than unrelated events. The questions those decisions left behind have only grown heavier with time, and they lead directly to the scientific pillars that once seemed to hold the prosecution theory in place. The currents that began to tell a different story. At trial, a hydrologist named Ralph Chung told the jury that wind and current data were consistent with a body placed south of Brooks Island where Scott said he had been fishing. That testimony placed Laci's remains on a path that seemed to begin at Scott's boat and end months later on the Richmond shoreline. Years later, experts retained by the Los Angeles Innocence Project applied Delft 3D hydrodynamic modeling, a system that did not exist in usable form during the original trial. The new simulation showed that the recovery locations of Laci's remains and Connor's body were inconsistent with a dump site at the fishing ground Scott described. The modeling favored placement in shallower water near Albany Bulb or a land-accessible point much closer to where the bodies appeared. Defense testing the jury never saw used a weighted dummy built to approximate Laci's late pregnancy weight. When the dummy was thrown from the same style of 14-foot aluminum boat, the vessel became dangerously unstable and in some trials nearly capsized. Only 2 strands of hair ever connected Laci to the boat. No blood or tissue was recovered from the vessel, the truck, or the home despite the violent nature of the crime the prosecution described to the jury. Chris Pixley has pointed out that the original expert testimony aligned neatly with the prosecution theory, yet rested on assumptions that modern computational tools now contradict in significant ways. When the physical path of the bodies no longer leads back to the place Scott said he was fishing, the entire sequence of events that the jury accepted requires a second and more careful examination. The water itself has become a silent witness that the original trial never fully heard or allowed the defense to challenge with the tools that now exist. That challenge to the dump location gains even greater force when it is placed beside the science of the unborn child whose measurements once locked the timeline in place. The growth charts that moved the clock forward. The prosecution's timeline depended heavily on the testimony of Dr. Gregory DeVore, who used 1990s fetal biometry charts and a single femur measurement to place Connor's death around December 23, 2002. That narrow window locked the murders firmly to the hours before Scott left home and made every later development in the investigation seem like confirmation of the state's central theory. Specialists reviewing the same bone measurements with modern standards reached a significantly different conclusion. Data from the Intergrowth 21st study published in 2014, along with World Health Organization and National Institute of Child Health and Human Development growth charts, place Connor's most likely death between December 28, 2002 and early January 2003. A tenured Harvard radiologist retained by the Los Angeles Innocence Project calculated a central estimate near January 1st. Forensic anthropologist Allison Galloway, who examined the remains at the time of autopsy, had already given a range that stretched as late January when she testified at the original trial. Because a fetus cannot survive long after the mother dies, a later death date for Connor means Laci herself remained alive for days after Scott's fishing trip. Experts such as Dr. Ronald Wapner have noted that without precise individual growth rates, any single measurement can only produce a statistical range rather than the tight and convenient window presented to the jury. The science available in 2004 simply could not support the degree of precision the prosecution asked the jury to accept as established fact. If both mother and child were still living after Scott drove away from Modesto, then the absence of any forensic trace in the house, the truck, or the boat becomes more than a minor inconvenience for the prosecution's theory. It becomes a widening gap that modern methods keep expanding with every new study that appears and every new expert who reviews the original measurements under current standards. You can feel the emotional weight of that shift if you consider what it means for a family that has lived with one version of the truth for more than 20 years and for a man who has always insisted the timeline never fit. The choices that looked like guilt. The prosecution theory required Scott to kill Laci inside the house, move her body through the residence, load it into the truck, transport it to the marina, transfer it into the boat, and finally dispose of it in the bay without leaving transferable biological material beyond 2 strands of hair found under a seat. Scott's later actions, dyeing his hair, carrying his brother's identification, a significant amount of cash, and new camping gear when he was arrested at a golf course in San Diego, were presented to the jury as clear and compelling signs of a guilty conscience. Defense voices including Pixley and Tusby have argued that a man facing a media-driven presumption of guilt and receiving credible death threats would reasonably attempt to disappear rather than remain in a city that had already decided his fate. Mark Garagos has said the affair itself, rather than any forensic proof, is what ultimately sealed the conviction in the minds of the public and the jury that heard the case. Handwritten notes recovered from the home and examined by a forensic document examiner appear consistent with Laci having known about the boat purchase and even shopping for marine equipment, which undercuts the claim that Scott acquired the vessel in complete secrecy solely for the purpose of disposing of a body. The complete lack of physical evidence in every location where the crime was supposed to have occurred sits beside a set of behavioral choices that can be read in more than one reasonable way, depending on the assumptions a person brings to the evidence. When the science of the currents and the science of fetal growth both move away from the original timeline, the empty rooms begin to look less like the scene of a carefully planned and perfectly executed crime, and more like the scene of a crime that may have happened somewhere else under circumstances the original investigation never fully explored. That possibility carries an emotional weight that is difficult to ignore once you allow yourself to sit with the full record. The long road to 2026. The Los Angeles Innocence Project formalized all of these issues in its detailed August 2025 petition that asked the court to examine the new scientific findings and the long-ignored leads. In April 2026, Judge Elizabeth Hill denied every claim contained inside that petition. The district attorneys celebrated the ruling as recognition that the arguments were nothing more than recycled material that courts had already considered and rejected. Sharon Rocha rejected the documentary's central premise outright and stated that no new evidence existed. The Innocence Project responded by preparing the appeal that is now moving toward a higher court under California's post-conviction procedures. Nanette Tusby continues to say that any individual denied a fair and thorough investigation from the beginning deserves a new trial. Chris Pixley maintains that the original verdict rests on unreliable scientific testimony and therefore cannot be considered constitutionally reliable under the standards that are supposed to protect every defendant. Mark Garagos repeats that he has never believed Scott capable of these particular crimes and that the evidence has never supported the conclusion that the jury reached. What has settled over the case in 2026 is not a clean resolution that brings peace to anyone involved. It is the realization that an investigation can become so deeply committed to its first conclusion that later evidence is treated as a threat to institutional authority rather than as an opportunity to correct a possible error. Whether Scott Peterson is innocent or guilty, the record now shows multiple independent lines of inquiry that were either never fully tested or actively closed off by decisions made inside the original investigation. The neighborhood sightings were set aside. The neighboring burglary evidence was destroyed. The currents were modeled with tools that no longer match modern computational standards. The growth of an unborn child was measured with charts that later research revised in significant ways. The worst truth is that the system has spent more energy protecting the finality of its verdict than testing whether that verdict still stands on solid ground after more than 20 years of scientific and investigative progress. The public is left with the uncomfortable knowledge that justice sometimes prefers the comfort of a definitive ending over the discomfort of another beginning that might lead to a different result. That preference for institutional finality may be the part of this story that outlasts every court filing and every documentary that tries to reopen the file, and it is the part that continues to grip anyone who has followed the case with an open mind. You can sense the human cost if you allow yourself to think about the years that have already passed and the years that may still pass while the higher court decides whether the original foundation is strong enough to carry the weight it was given. The documentary that aired in July of 2026 did not invent these questions. It simply refused to let them remain buried under the language of finality. The appeal that is now moving forward will force at least one more court to look at the science and the leads that were never fully chased. Whatever that court decides, the deeper problem remains. An investigation that closes doors too quickly and a system that protects those closed doors for decades leaves everyone connected to the case in a state of unresolved tension. The families continue to carry their grief. The man in prison continues to insist on his innocence. The public continues to wonder whether the truth was ever fully allowed to surface. That unresolved tension is what makes the story of Laci and Connor and Scott feel unfinished even after more than 20 years, and it is what keeps the questions alive long after the cameras have moved on to other cases. What do you make of the new science and the leads that were never chased? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell me whether you believe this case still deserves another day in court.